Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into Thomas Sowell's pretty provocative book, Social Justice Fallacies, and we're going to break down some of its core arguments.
This quote from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, it really nails the spirit of what we're about to get into. Sowell's whole approach is built on empirical data, and he uses it to question some of the core assumptions behind today's big debates. All right, here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll hit Sowell's central question. Then we'll unpack two of his biggest fallacies. After that, we'll see how he applies those ideas to racial disparities, and we'll wrap up with the real-world consequences he talks about. Okay, let's get right into it. The book kicks off by challenging a really fundamental idea in what Sowell calls the social justice vision. This idea that whenever you see big statistical gaps between groups, it must be because of some kind of discrimination. So his whole point is that, look, if you actually scan through human history and across different cultures, equal outcomes are just incredibly rare. He argues they're the exception, not the rule. And that means if we really want to find the cause of disparities, we have to look at a much wider range of factors than just injustice. Okay, so that brings us to the first major fallacy Sowell really digs into. He calls it the equal chances fallacy. And this is basically the assumption that, hey, if it weren't for discrimination, every group would have a pretty equal shot at succeeding in every single field. And to really get this point across, Sowell poses a pretty straightforward question. Why is it that in a world with open competition, we see these consistent patterns of different groups dominating completely different areas? A great example he uses is professional sports. I mean, think about it. The rules are exactly the same for everybody, but you still see these really distinct patterns. His point isn't subtle. Nobody seriously thinks Californians are being kept out of the NHL, but they are totally outnumbered by Canadians for reasons that have nothing to do with discrimination. So, what's the takeaway here? Well, from Sowell's perspective, it's all about these countless other factors. Things like a colder climate that encourages ice skating, or a culture that's been brewing beer for 1,000 years. These things create different, developed capabilities in different groups, long before anyone even thinks about applying for a job. And this quote, man, it just perfectly sums up his whole point. The history, the skills, the culture of a group, it's all baked into its present. The past isn't just something that happened way back when. It's actively shaping the tools people bring to the table right now. All right, now this is where things get really interesting, and maybe a bit controversial. Sowell takes this exact same logic and applies it to racial disparities in America, really pushing for a look at factors that go beyond racism as the one and only explanation. He digs into the government's own numbers and points to something he finds fascinating. He argues that family structure is actually a more powerful predictor of poverty than race is. He'll point out that for Black married couple families, the poverty rate has been in the single digits for decades now, which is lower than the national average. Meanwhile, the rate for white single mother households is consistently way more than double that. And get this, over 9 million. That's the number of Black Americans who had incomes higher than the median income of white Americans back in 2020. Sowell uses a stat like this to push back on what he sees as an overly simplistic narrative of universal Black disadvantage. And he doesn't just stop at national averages, he drills down even further. So look at this chart. It shows that in some overwhelmingly white counties in Appalachia, the median household income isn't just way below the white national median, it's actually thousands of dollars lower than the Black national median. For him, this suggests that things like culture and geography can create outcomes that just don't fit into a simple racial box. Okay, so after laying all that groundwork about complex causes, Sowell gets to his next big idea. A lot of his critique of social justice policies is based on what he calls the chess pieces fallacy. So what is the chess pieces fallacy? Well, the idea is actually pretty simple. Policymakers often think of people like, chess pieces on a board. They assume you can just move them around with a new rule and they'll passively go along. But in the real world, people aren't chess pieces. They react to incentives, and those reactions can sometimes lead to the exact opposite of what the policy intended. A classic example he points to is tax policy. Check out what happened in Maryland. They brought in a millionaire tax, and the whole goal was to raise over $100 million. So what happened? Well, a third of the state's millionaires just vanished from the tax rolls. So the state didn't gain revenue, it actually lost over $200 million. The chess pieces just moved right off the board. And he uses the same chess pieces logic when looking at the minimum wage. The history here is pretty striking.
Back in 1948, the unemployment rate for Black and white male teens was almost identical. But according to Sowell, after a series of really aggressive minimum wage hikes starting in the 50s, this huge gap opened up, and Black teen unemployment just soared.
And to back this up, Sowell brings in the heavy-hitter economist Milton Friedman. The argument goes like this. When you set a price floor for labor, that's what a minimum wage is, it can make it too expensive for a business to take a risk on someone with very few skills or little experience. And according to this view, that prices young minority men out of those critical first jobs, the very jobs where they would have gotten the skills they needed to move up. So, okay, after all this, why does any of it matter? What's the big deal about these so-called fallacies? Well, according to Sowell, when you build policies on top of these flawed assumptions, it's not just that they don't work, it's that they can actually cause real harm. So if you boil it all down from Sowell's point of view, it comes to this. Disparities are complicated. Giving everyone the same opportunity doesn't mean you'll get the same results. And if you build policies on a wrong diagnosis of the problem, you could end up hurting the very people you're trying to help.
So in the end, what Sowell's really doing is making a case for realism. He's arguing that we have to look at the world as it actually is, not how we wish it were, and that we have to judge policies by their results, not by their good intentions.
And that leaves us, and you, with this final, really challenging question that his work puts on the table. If disparities aren't automatic proof of injustice, then what are the right standards? How do we build policies that actually genuinely expand opportunity for everybody? It's a huge question, and it's definitely worth thinking about long after you're done with this explainer.